Hi, everybody, and welcome to Coaching Conversations. And I'm really excited today to have this conversation and talk about mostly some of the ideas in this book right here, Belonging Through a Culture of Dignity. Two big words in there, belonging and dignity, and I hope we explore them both. I think they're really, really critical for actually having equitable schools. And I'm thrilled that Floyd Cobb and John Krownapple have joined me for this conversation about their book. And I have questions I posted on Twitter. I can't wait to figure out what the answer to this might be. And I'm going to dive in as soon as I tell you a little bit about both of our authors. Floyd is an adjunct faculty member with Moggridge College of Education at the University of Denver. His coursework focuses on teaching methods, along with the intersections of race, class, power, and privilege. He's held a leadership role in issues related to educational equity for almost 15 years, and he's served as a central office leader responsible for curriculum and instruction. He's got a PhD in curriculum and instruction and is the author of the book Leading While Black and co-author of the book Interrogating Whiteness, Relentless Power. So Dr. Cobb, I'm really grateful for you being here.
Thanks for having me.
And John Krownapple. John Krownapple specializes in helping organizations learn and grow in the area of human relations. His career has focused on education, diversity and inclusion, equity and social justice. In his book, Guiding Teams to Excellence with Equity, he provides a protocol for facilitating systemic equitable change. His most recent book, Included Through a Culture of Dignity, co-authoring with Dr. Floyd Cobb, concretely illustrates his mission to help each of us get in touch with our dignity so that we can honor the dignity of others on structural, interpersonal, and intrapersonal levels. In doing so, John believes we can grow as effective organizations, inclusive communities, as a democratic society. Simply put, we can improve the quality of our lives and the lives of others through dignity. An inspirational speaker, workshop facilitator, and a good friend of the instructional coaching group. John's currently an adjunct professor at Johns Hopkins, where his coursework focuses on issues that emerge from diversity. But I know them both because they presented at the Teaching, Learning, Coaching Conference and blew people away. And John and I did an interview previously. And I've always been in this situation where Floyd and I talk for a minute and we meet like going from session to ASCD or something. So I'm thrilled that I get to actually have a full-on conversation with both of them. And I urge you both to go for it. Feel free to call me out if I get something wrong from your perspective or I just haven't got the knowledge. And I just want to say that I hardly ever present now where I don't bring up the concept of dignity because of the work you've done. It is rare that I don't share it because I think it's such a powerful, almost paradigm shaking kind of concept. So I'm grateful you're here, excited about the conversation. And I have these two warm-up questions that if you'll just humor me, I'll ask you the question. So the first one is, what's something most people don't know about you? So I'll let you figure out who gets to answer first.
I'll go ahead and answer first. I think most people who know me know this, but people who don't know me quite as well may not know that when we're not living in a pandemic and the world is a bit more normal, I compete in triathlons. So I've completed the Ironman twice, along with a number of other different triathlons. So when I'm not working and not helping out my kids and writing, that's typically what I use to take up my time.
Wow, which ones did you do?
So I've done the Ironman Boulder twice. I think I've done Oceanside 70.3 3 times. I've done the Boulder 70.3 about 3 or 4 times. So I think I've probably in total done around 12 or 13 races overall.
My partner, Jenny, did Madison.
Okay, yes.
And it was one of the best days of my life. In fact, sometimes when I present, I have the picture of her, because I don't have an audience anymore. So I have a little picture of Jenny sitting there right after she crossed the finish line. It was really a wonderful day, especially because I didn't have to do it. I just had to watch it, so.
Absolutely.
It was wonderful. But congratulations, that's really something. John, how about you?
Well, my athletic career pretty much ended with, in college, I was the mascot for my college. Went to the Maryland, University of Maryland. I was the terrapin there, and then actually went pro, so to say, and was the mascot for the Baltimore Orioles for 7 years, while I was moonlighting. I was moonlighting while I started my career teaching. So I'd teach in the daytime and drive to the stadium and go up to the cafeteria and get a crab cake or a hot dog or something, and then, dress up in that suit. And, so I would be on the sidelines while Floyd is doing this, Iron Man. I'd be cheering him on, I guess. But
high five in the mascot.
Yeah, high fiving. Back when I was the Oriole bird, I'd go all over the place, all kinds of events, and marathons would be one of them. Be there at the finish line, putting the aluminum, the whatever they're made out of, blankets on people and that type of thing.
Okay, so I've been doing this. I've been doing this coaching conversations since sometime in March, and you have just set the bar at a much higher level than anybody else who's come through. We've got the Baltimore. What's the mascot called for the Orioles?
Oh, that's the Oriole bird. The Oriole bird was just inducted into the Mascot Hall of Fame in June. By the way, it's located in Indiana.
Long overdue, in my opinion.
That's right.
Long overdue. I know. It took so long.
Probably was a petition. I think probably that was it. Iron Man. And so were you the mascot when the Terrapins won the national championship in basketball?
No, that was a little bit later. I was there from, I graduated in 96.
Right.
So the Terps won the national championship against the Hoosiers in 2001, I believe.
Jayhawks they beat.
Oh, yeah. That's right.
That would be my University of Kansas.
I think that
or
was
maybe we met in the Final Four. I don't know.
I think it was the
all
Final
I know
Four,
is that Maryland knocked us out. That was it, and we were. This is Roy Williams days. We were looking for that. Okay, well, second question: what's something you're grateful for right now?
I think amidst all the crazy, I'm grateful for the more time that I have an opportunity to spend with my kids and my family, albeit kind of unusual circumstances that are forcing it. I do think that there likely won't be another time, or hopefully won't be another time where we spend this much time together. So I am appreciative and grateful of that.
Yeah, for me it's similar. It's my family. I have 4 children, so as young as 2 months old, baby Owen, and then as old as 16. So I have 16, 13, 2 years old, and 2 months old. So, and a blended family. So my older 2 are here half of the time. And since March, something happened that would never have happened, which is we had all this time together. And especially, the 2-year-old had so much time with the 16-year-old, which never would have happened because of, her busy schedule and the 2-year-old being at daycare. They would maybe have an hour of time a week where they would be in each other's presence, but they ended up having every single day. And to see their bond, especially, is just, I'm incredibly grateful because it never would have happened.
That's interesting. It's just so interesting. Looking forward to seeing that 2-month-old. So,
yeah,
I don't know. I'm looking forward to seeing both of you sometime.
Yeah.
Looking forward to seeing anybody actually. Well, I've got some questions I want to go through, and we'll see where we go. But the first one really just is the heart of your work is around the concept of dignity. I remember, John, I interviewed you last year, I think, and I said, I never heard of this idea of dignity as opposed to respect. And you said, neither did I until Floyd Cobb told me about it. So tell me what you mean by dignity and, why you think it's important.
Yeah, so the idea of dignity actually came to me through, as I was kind of getting to the final stages of the Leading While Black book. And what the ideas that I was working through at that time really focused on just the powerful impact of humiliation. And how humiliation really just plays such an incredible role in our lives. And what I was trying to understand and think about was just the antithesis of humiliation. There was no other motivation outside of that, and came across this sort of general idea of humiliation studies in general but also this wonderful book written by a professor at Harvard by the name of Donna Hicks. And what I was really just trying to do was just to get a better understanding of this concept. And the more I started to get into it, the clearer and simpler it started to become in terms of really starting to understand and recognizing one's inherent value and worth. And typically when people feel as if they're being humiliated, what they're feeling is that there's an absence of that inherent value and worth that is being honored at the time. And you know, what Dr. Hicks talks about quite a bit is just the distinction between dignity and respect, which is dignity as being something that is inherent, whereas respect is something that is earned. So I can respect you for the things that you may have done in life in terms of, you know, your accomplishments or, you know, books you've written or the type of parent that I see that you are. But in terms of dignity, it has to do with something that is inherent, something that is we're all born with, and ultimately something that can't or shouldn't be able to be taken away. And so with that, that was kind of where it all started. And, you know, realized that there was some ideas that could emerge into a book with this, particularly related to education, and how throughout all of these kind of conversations around equity and diversity and inclusion, you know, trying to find ways to simplify it. And eventually that's what led into some of the ideas that led to this book.
One thing Floyd helped me see, or maybe we helped each other see, I don't know, early on, was that the work that I had been engaged in for probably over 10 years at that point really had to do with helping whole groups of people move away from indignity, you know, in practice and policy to dignity. In other words, actions that honor people's inherent value and worth. And I saw that was the core of what I was trying to do with my work around equity-focused professional development. At the time, I was heavily relying on a framework and the work of Randy Lindsay, Dolores Lindsay, Kakanza Nuri Robbins, Ray Terrell, Brendan Franklin Campbell Jones, called the Cultural Proficiency Framework. And it helped me see and crystallize, you know, what I was really trying to do, like the essence of it. And so that was so intriguing. And back then, which I don't know, Floyd, 3 years ago,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, it started basically a daily thread of text messages between Floyd and I that if someone could harvest those text messages, that would be a pretty awesome, that would be real talk. That would be like the story behind the story, where I mean, we just learned and grew together. And at one point thought, okay, this is the key here is we talked a lot about remixing this approach to equity where dignity became the action. So the idea of teaching with dignity, leading with dignity would prompt the question of, okay, what does that look like in action?
So is it fair to say that dignity is good? And we're looking for the good in the person. I don't mean to trivialize the term, and that it can't be taken away. Are those two truths, do you think?
I would say that they're truths in the sense that we're trying to recognize that every human being is worthy and every human being is valuable. Sometimes we don't always act that way, but every human being is worthy and every human being is valuable. And the sort of sociological factors that confuse that kind of are I think a much longer story, which we can probably talk about a little bit later. But at its core, you know, what we're always trying to do, particularly in educational spaces, but life in general is always trying to do, is recognize that despite how someone might be behaving, they still are inherently valuable, and we've got to find a way to figure out a way to push through that.
You asked me to position this in the context of what's happening now. For some people, a racial awakening, and For others, they've known it for a long, long time, what's happening with respect to race. So do you want to just comment on your perspective on what's happening now with respect to race in America? What's your perspective on it? What do you see, or maybe how it provides a context for the conversation about dignity?
Yeah, I mean, I think that if we look at, I think this moment in which we're living, and you know, being forced to bear witness to the repeated killings of Black people, principally, I think I think fits in line with what we were trying to convey and communicate with this book, which is that you know, we hear these sort of arguments about calls for Black lives, and you know what John and I have talked about in other presentations is, you know, the cry for asking for people to value Black lives is effectively a call to be able to recognize the dignity and the humanity, you know, that Black people have. If you were to listen to the press conference that occurred just earlier this week with Mr. Blake's parents, and particularly thinking about his sister and his mother. If you listen specifically to what they were saying, it was just saying this man has humanity, right? He is a human. And you know, you'll hear this again. He did not deserve, right, to be treated in this way. And so I think that it blends quite nicely with the sort of other idea that, you know, sense is in the book related to belonging, which I think is really central to these ideas around profiling in general, which is that if the reason why someone gets profiled is typically because there is someone who has made a determination that this person does not belong here. That is effectively what is happening. And then as a result of that, the person then gets treated with indignity, right? And then there becomes this sort of back and forth that occurs. And in most of these occasions, the law or law enforcement typically will win the battle, right? And what that has led to is, I think, this sort of conflagration, you know, throughout the country around the fact that it is exhausting to have to justify one's inherent value and worth every single day. And the emotional exhaustion, I think, is what has led, coupled with everything else we're dealing with the pandemic, to just this incredible spillover effect that has been just incredibly heavy. And so, you know, I think that, you know, again, what we tried to do was, you know, while all of these great writers and folks in academia write with these sort of incredible theories and, you know, use great words and terms, what John and I were trying to do was to strip all of that down to the best of our ability, and just to make it at a very sort of simple and human level. And by no means are we the first people to do this, but we just wanted to use this as our attempt, you know, really to enter into the conversation and the debate.
And I think, Jim, when you mentioned the word reckoning, I think what we're dealing with is coming to grips and trying to resolve the fact that collectively we have not honored the dignity of Black life in our country and beyond, but just dealing with the country, and really have yet to affirm the right for Black Americans to say that they belong. And that's what we're dealing with right now, are those two issues. Interestingly enough, in the bio that you read, we had the original title of the book, which was included through A Culture of Dignity. And throughout the process of writing, I still remember that text too. Floyd said, "I really think belonging is the special sauce here." And and I said, "Yeah, I've been thinking that too." And we were very much influenced by the work of Professor John Powell. He's the executive director of the Othering and Belonging Institute out of UC Berkeley. And his work has a crispness to it in describing the issues as othering and belonging, or the patterns in the systems as systems of othering and systems of belonging. And the idea of belonging being something that was bigger than what's often described as a sense of belonging, right? A sense of belonging is kind of helpful to gauge the extent to which people perceive that they're experiencing belonging. But the idea that belonging is big, belonging is being a full member, a full and complete member who not only feels a certain way, you know, respected, accepted, validated, et cetera, but they're also able to make demands on the culture without, you know, these negative repercussions. They're able to co-create a way of being instead of conforming oneself into whatever standards are already existing. So the idea of belonging became to us the goal, you know, it captured the meaning of what we're really trying to work toward with, you know, all of these great theories and all these equity pedagogies that, you know, have kind of come in and out of vogue. We feel it's at the core, and the way we get there is by learning to better honor dignity.
I love the way the two go together conceptually. I think that gives me a language for understanding things. I didn't have the language before. Both of them, you know, belonging and dignity. I think belonging, I wonder how many people would say, I feel like I belong where I am. You know, I belong in this school, I belong in this community, or they feel like I'm a stranger in a strange land. And then often the way that concept of othering, you know, when we dehumanize the other person and we deny their dignity, they're not going to feel like they belong. That happens in all kinds of ways. And I think right now there's a belief, well, we've got to do something about this. But one of the things that you talk about in your book is this, I want to make sure I got my phrasing right, dysfunctional cycle of equity work. And my fear, as I look at your book, is that people will have lived through 2020 and then they'll put in place a dysfunctional cycle of equity work. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are. First off, what is that cycle? And then what are your thoughts about that issue?
Yeah, so the cycle is basically the pattern that organizations get into when they realize that they need to engage in some type of diversity or equity work. You know, it's funny, the way we arrived at this, I was literally driving to work one morning and John and I were talking about something, and we just emerged in terms of, you know, we already know what's going to happen because there's a pattern that's going to happen, and there's the event and the thing that, and then it leads to this, and then this, and then this, and then this, and it's this predictive pattern that we found, you know, that happens, which is that, you know, there's typically an event, and what's unique about 2020 is that we're living through a national series of events as opposed to, you know, a locally based event that, you know, elevates these ideas to the surface. And, you know, basically what happens is, you know, there becomes this sort of organizational response of something has to be done. And, you know, we saw it this summer when everybody was releasing their, you know, corporate statements, you know, in May, June timeframe. And basically what happens is, you know, folks start going down this sort of typical road, and, you know, it's book studies and it's committees, and it's, you know, trying to figure out how to do something without ever really, you know, knowing exactly what to do. And, you know, one of the problems that I think that most organizations get into around this is that they tend not to have any evidence or any data as to the magnitude of the problem within their specific organization. And so they just know they want to fix something. And so, you know, and eventually what happens is you'll start to try to fix it. And then, you know, you'll do your book talks and you do your book studies, and, you know, people who were energized were like, okay, but when are we going to do something? Right. And other folks are like, well, you upset me and you hurt my feelings. Right. And then eventually what it does is it leads to, you know, this sort of gradual going away over time. And then eventually what happens is something else kind of flares up. So we could take this literal summer as an example, right? Mm-hmm. Which was, right in the spring, summertime, the uprisings occur, everybody's releasing a statement, changing policies. Nike says Juneteenth is a paid holiday, right?
This isn't who we are.
This is who we are, right? And then all of a sudden it starts to settle down, right? Because, while many of the protests and uprisings hadn't ceased, it left the public eye. And then last week, we have an incident, or this, I'm losing track of time. We have an incident that then brings it back up into the public eye, and it's like, oh, well, we got to do something, and that typically, creates this ongoing cycle. And absent, any consideration or really understanding of how these ideas impact the actual people within the spaces with which you're working, or your classrooms in which you're teaching, typically you're going to fall into the cycle, because there's typically what happens is that it doesn't create any real lasting or meaningful change.
Want to add to that, John?
The only thing that was popping up to mind when Floyd was describing the cycle, and just how, wave 2, iteration 2, right, that we're experiencing right now, literally like this week, was I think a clear idea of how the problems with implementation happen is, if you recall, a couple months ago, Amazon sold out of several titles that deal with anti-racism. And so the extent to which those books were even read or discussed or whatever, who knows? But that's part of the cycle, is that there's some attempt to do something, but ultimately the implementation there in terms of taking action is where the problems are. And there's all types of, there's all types of issues. Just bringing it back into our, educational forum here. Floyd and I compared notes for, over the years here on the problems with implementation of culturally responsive teaching, because that's been, an approach really at its core, again, is trying to honor the dignity that whole populations of students deserve, but have not had. We've talked about misimplementation, everything from teachers thinking that they have to be some kind of cultural anthropologist, and then all of a sudden they're actually othering whole groups of students that this approach was attempting to help them better understand and relate to. So there's these problems that pop up, and for us, it's not the theories or the pedagogies. There's something in terms of implementation here that's missing. And we think it's this deep understanding of the core of dignity and belonging, no matter what, no matter whether you're trying to implement restorative justice to build more community and deal with, disciplinary type of problems that we have, or whether it's, something like culturally responsive teaching.
I've just been writing about it this week. What you're talking about, I call it nominal implementation. So implementation in name only versus deep implementation. And so nominal implementation is, oh, we're doing PLCs. Oh, we're doing Marzano. Oh, we're doing culture responsive teaching. But really the books are on the shelf and there's nothing really changing. And so my really preliminary thinking is, if you want deep implementation, you have to have deep planning, which is we really think through, what does this really mean? And then you have to have deep knowledge, which means we tear apart the literature. And then there has to be deep learning, which means you have a cycle of learning. This is what's supposed to be happening and it's not happening, and how do we do it? And I'm not sure that's enough, but what you've described, I think manifests itself in lots of ways. There's lots of schools who have, thousands of books that are on the shelves that aren't even looked at anymore, but at one point we were going to become, we're going to do understanding by design, all really great things, but they're not much good if they're not used, they're not implemented. And the same, and I'm writing it in the context of coaching, the same thing with coaching. Well, we've hired coaches, but actually 0% of their time last week was spent on coaching. They're doing all this other stuff.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So to some extent in response, and maybe it's not a response, but we offer a more effective model, which is the dignity framework. Could you tell me what you mean by the dignity framework? And let me interrupt and just say, I just love what you're thinking, and what you've put together in this book. I think, at the risk of having my own little equity cycle right here, I really do think recognizing how we diminish the dignity of other people is a really, really important thing. Whether it's just applying a label or dismissing a group, you know, they're all Marxists, let's just get rid of them. I've given them a name now, let's get rid of that group, or whatever. Finding a way to not cut to the core, but have we honored the dignity of the individual? I think that's really, really, really powerful message. And so then what do we mean by the dignity framework? Because that stands at the heart of this.
John, go ahead.
I think we can go back and forth on this with a little history to how that emerged, because that was just amazing. So we were very much inspired by Professor Donna Hicks's work on dignity, as Floyd mentioned. And in her work, she has 10 essentials of dignity. She says that we're all born with dignity. You can't gain it, you can't lose it. Much different than respect. We all know that there are people who have gained our respect and we've lost, respect, that type of thing. But she says that we're all born with dignity, but we're not born knowing how to honor it. It's something that we need to learn. Matter of fact, we're very much like hardwired to other and to violate dignity. And then when we look at the ego, that's all about protecting itself as well. So it's something that we really need to learn and practice with a high degree of intentionality. And in her work, she has 10 essentials of dignity. And her work, she's not a pre-K-12 educator, nor is her specialty education. She's in the world of international affairs and conflict resolution. And she's spent her career helping groups, individuals, and even whole nations resolve their conflicts. And she came to the understanding that all human conflict emerges from violations of dignity or perceived violations of dignity. It really doesn't matter. So whether we're talking about a quarrel between a loved one or a war between nation states, it emerges from conflict, from violations of dignity. And we would say that concept applies to our work in terms of what's called educational equity. So we were working with those 10 essentials early on and really digging in and thinking about how they applied to, the work we do in education. And we're also considering all this work that is under this category of humiliation studies. And what we started to see were that there were certain patterns that kept coming up. For example, one was the ability to listen to someone else. Another would be the ability to empathize. And so when we really started looking at all of these ideas, what emerged for us were four, we called them conditions early on, and then we call them now dispositions. 4 dispositions that you can develop within yourself or your organization that make it a heck of a lot easier to honor dignity. And those are the ability to listen, to empathize, to remain open. So openness and patience are the 4 that work in concert, to help us develop the ability to honor dignity. And when we originally had them as overlapping circles, it was a Venn diagram, then it became a 4-piece Venn diagram.
It's education. You have to have a Venn diagram.
Yeah, right.
If it was business, you'd have to have one of those 2x2 diagrams. That's just the way it goes.
That's the way it works.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt.
No, that's okay. What happened when we looked at it in that manner, we saw when these dispositions overlapped, certain feelings emerged. So the easiest one to understand is when listening and empathy overlap, people feel validated, and so we started looking at how these dispositions overlap and the feelings that they create with people or within yourself. And that was the start of what became the indicators of belonging, which is one of the 4 components of the framework. And then when we looked at the overlap of those, it was really clear what emerged, which became our 4 standards for dignity. And those standards apply to how you treat yourself and how you treat others and the type of organization that you want to set up in terms of policies. They're very universal.
Yeah, and so what emerged from that was kind of our overall thinking as it relates back to the cycle in terms of how most diversity initiatives wind up failing. And one of the pieces that we were really focused on was trying to figure out how to break through that. And the thing that I think that we kept coming back to was that when these sort of equity, diversity, and inclusion initiatives are implemented, one of the primary motivations or mechanisms that is used in a lot of them, or at least people walk away feeling with it, is feeling this deep sense and feeling of shame, right? And so what then happens is that in the process of attempting to create a more equitable and inclusive, environment or professional development, what that leads to is people feeling that sort of sense of humiliation, similar to what I talked about, or having their dignity violated in the process. And so that then leads to that sort of general and overall stall, which is what then kind of helps to create this sort of perpetual cycle in which we're engaged. And so we were really trying to think through, how do we find a way to explain this cycle and this work in such a way that it helps to think differently about how most equity, diversity, and inclusion training programs are delivered.
So how did doing this work, how did it affect you? Like, how were you changed by writing this book, do you think? Or maybe you just were validated. Maybe there wasn't a change, but did anything happen in the process? Because this is pretty powerful stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I think, yes. I mean, I think it's something that I've at least tried to continue to keep these reminders and apply to my own life. As I had mentioned before, this was an extension, I think, of some of the work that I had originally wrote in my Leading While Black book. And that was a much more painful process. So much so that, I've got stacks of the books downstairs, and, sometimes have trouble, going back and reading portions of it, because there's so much emotion that is still associated, with that piece of work. But really, I think trying to think through, in general, how to be a better supervisor, how to be a better partner, husband, father, those are the ideas that are, that I think constantly come to mind, certainly as it relates to me being a teacher, as well. Just trying to find ways to keep these concepts in the front of my mind, when thinking about really just human conflict in general and interactions in general, and having the words and the terms to be able to actually explain what's going on. Because I think, again, what we attempted to do with this was to try to use ideas and concepts that we felt were universally experienced. And what we mean by that is, not everybody is going to understand the immediate feeling of what racial discrimination feels like. And not everybody's going to understand what the immediate, emotion related to, homophobic attacks or, class-based attacks. But certainly we know what it feels like to not feel as if we belong. We probably all have some experience with that. And we all certainly know what it feels like to not feel as if, we're being treated with dignity. And so those are the things that we were thinking about. And those are the tools that I think, at least I try to use in terms of my daily life.
Mine was similar. It was deeply reflective. I mean, the process was so personal in terms of thinking about the person that I want to be, the parent that I want to be, the partner that I want to be. And much of our framework, actually the entire framework represents that. It provides a vision, it provides a guide. And along with that, I have to say, absolutely have to say this is extremely hard work. Not writing the book, but living up to someone who's able to honor dignity. And so I don't want to misrepresent myself at all and claim that I've arrived or that I'm, more enlightened or anything, because it's almost the opposite. It's like I see how I'm missing the mark so often that it would be really easy to violate my own dignity and beat myself up and everything. So it's this constant I missed the mark there. Let's go back and restart, and let me forgive myself and try to get it right next time, and Floyd very much is a student of the core themes around the civil rights era, and was emphasizing to me along the way just about how dignity was at the core of the successes that emerged from the work of that era, and how extremely hard it is. It sounds so simple that we learn to honor each other's dignity and then we can move on, but like it was so eye-opening to me, this process, that I look back through history and see that spiritual leaders have been saying the same thing for thousands of years. And it would be so disingenuous for me to say, here are the tips and tricks to, equity or to living a fulfilled life or whatever, because obviously they're very, very hard. If people, enlightened folks, have been talking about this for, eons, and still we're falling short. I'll just use one of, Donna Hicks's 10 essentials for dignity of what people want from each other is accountability, and if you mess up and violate, my dignity, what I really want is an apology. I want you to own that and say you're sorry, because I feel hurt, right? And it's almost daily that I see people that are unwilling to apologize for hurting other people. And I think, okay, sounds so easy, learn to apologize, but obviously the data would suggest that this is extremely hard for us to do. So I think the magnitude of distill, or even the contradiction of distilling it down to these terms that are easy to understand and relate to, but at the same time, so hard to actually achieve.
It seems to me that people who read your book, who do your work, need to be, if it's something that's authentic, going through a similar kind of journey of deep reflection. And I really like Kristen Neff's idea of self-compassion, being compassionate. We can't deny our own dignity. We need to be, I'm doing the best I can here, but we don't want to use I'm doing the best I can as an excuse to stay where we are, but to recognize, I guess, give grace to others and give grace to ourselves in this kind of journey of awareness. You talk, and you've mentioned this a bit already, but you talk about a vocabulary of dignity, a language of dignity. Do you want to add anything more to that? Because that seems like a key concept, developing your own language for understanding dignity.
It seems like a dignity literacy is a good way to describe it. And right. One of the parts of our framework is we have a flip side to the dignity honored graphic and overlapping circles, which is basically the inverse of all of it. So instead of empathy, it's apathy. Instead of listening, it's denial. Instead of openness, it's judgment. We have 4 indicators of othering to balance the indicators of belonging. So I think the beauty and the hope, like you were describing, the personal journey that folks go through with reading the book, when you do that as a collective, as a cohort, as a group, as a team, developing a shared language, that has a lot to do with the hope that Floyd and I have to real change emerging from this work. Because when we have a shared language to describe what we're seeing in a way that's constructive and healthy, then we can dig out the practices and policies that are harmful, unhealthy, and violate dignity, get rid of them. And Ibram Kendi talks about this analogy of treating racism like you would treat cancer. Similar type of idea. If we're able to flood the organization or the body with a treatment, practices and policies that honor dignity, we have a shot of getting there. But if we don't have the language to describe what we're seeing, then we're not going to be able to really truly assess and identify what needs to change. So that's what I think of. And I think in terms of coaching, that shared language is just so powerful.
Yes, I agree 100%. I think that language allows for dialogue, but it also helps you see things you couldn't otherwise see, because you go, oh, he's just othered that person and what he did, and so forth. Floyd, you want to add to this?
No, I think John kind of covered what I was going to cover there.
Well, I've got I'm going to give you the Twitter question then.
All right.
Okay. So this is what I've been thinking about as I've explored this concept and thought about what it means, is this question. So Audre Lorde, I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly, as I recently saw quoted on Instagram, so it's got to be legitimate,
Absolutely.
said that the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. It's also, I think it's a key concept in Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed. You can't use the tools of the oppressor to overcome oppression. And yet we slip into that all the time. You know, the oppressed become dictators, you know. So I see this as a kind of cautionary commentary on how we respond to talk these days, especially on social media, but everywhere. The temptation to talk in a way that ignores the dignity of the other person is overwhelming because there's so much anger. I mean, this week we talked about the awakening because another young man has been shot down, and yet trending on Twitter this morning was all lives matter. It's a slap to the idea. Oh, yes, all lives matter, which is why Black Lives Matter. But regardless, you know, it is an othering thing, that little hashtag. So I'm thinking your ideas about dignity can help us better address toxic conversations we hear around us, or I hear around me, especially related to politics, racism. So my long-winded question is this: how do we respond to people whose views are different than ours about human rights and race? Is there ever a time to ignore dignity and just attack an opponent with all the anger we feel? Or how do we deal with that? What do we do?
Yeah, you know, I think the challenge with that is kind of, if we go back to Audre Lorde's quote, and thinking about the master's tools. One of the master's tools in this particular context is shaming, right? So one of the very ways that subordination has occurred is through this process, as I had mentioned before, either through shaming or through humiliation, right? Humiliation being different than shame, you know, having to do with, you know, one's deservedness, you know, of the emotion. And, you know, what I think we've both learned throughout this process is that if the only tool that you have to be able to, you know, combat, you know, this conversation is with shame, you're likely not going to lead to a good outcome, right? And Twitter is sort of filled with it, right? Where, you know, you're not going to get into a really constructive dialogue with somebody, you know, in a limited number of characters, you know, particularly whose main purpose is, you know, to try to shame you or to make you feel humiliated, or, you know, a lot of the things that we'll see on Twitter, which is that, you know, any number of the folks who were killed, you know, this year by the police were deserving of their own deaths, right? And so trying to engage with them, with people who aren't necessarily interested in engaging, they're the only aim that they have, you know, is moving towards some form or some version of shame, isn't going to be productive on either end, because there's really no need or desire for a relationship to exist between those two people. It's just sort of power over, right? Who's right, who's wrong. The more nuanced position in that has to do with someone who is actually interested in learning, right? And really trying to help to educate someone who is sincere, you know, in actually listening and understanding to this perspective of another, in this particular context and climate. Now, unfortunately, in the world in which we're living right now, there's not a whole lot of that, right? People are pretty much camped out in, whichever group, that they feel most comfortable, or, a greatest sense of belonging. But I think that if we find those individuals who are sincere and who are true in engaging in constructive dialogue, approaching that from a position of, assault or shame isn't going to elevate us to that place that Paulo Freire talked about, right? Which is this imagining a new reality that is not even within the context of those who oppress to actually be able to exist. And so there is an unfortunate burden that is placed upon those who have been subjugated to wind up becoming above, as Freire mentioned, which was the sort of mindset in which the oppressor engaged. Because if we're constantly trying to just, engage in this tit for tat, this back and forth, this name calling, we're never going to be able to get to a place where we arrive. Now, this doesn't exclude accountability. And I think that's the thing where people sometimes, go awry. Does that just mean that, people don't have to be held accountable for the behavior in which they engage? No, that isn't the case. People certainly need to be held accountable, but not so much so that it leads, that the accountability is entirely focused on attempting to achieve some form of humiliation, right? And we think about that in schools, if we were to kind of circle this all the way back, which is, as a former disciplinarian, talking about this distinction between discipline and punishment, right? Which is that the discipline or the consequence is pretty agnostic. You do this, you get that, right? And there's no association with who you are, but rather the association is with what you did. That is the accountability. The punishment winds up taking that to one additional level, right? Because it moves into this element of shame and humiliation. And so that, in my mind, is to get back to long-winded, is a much different way of thinking about it, that there is no way where we can ever get to a point where we can ignore, someone's dignity. It's always there. They may not be behaving in a way that is reflective of it or respective of it or honors it, but we don't arrive at a more productive place if we lose sight of that in the process.
And I want to hear from you in a sec, John, but if we truly come from a place of empathy, understanding the other person's needs and the other person's emotions, and understanding in ourselves what's keeping us from having that empathy, it should make it more likely that we'll be able to honor the dignity of the person. Like, if we can really see into the person's life and understand what experience has brought them where they are, it's going to be more productive than not having empathy and just saying, "Oh, he is this or she is that." I think you're for no longer a Venn diagram, but your four concepts are really critical. But in particular, listening and empathy. I think if you have a hope of reaching someone, if you listen to them and they feel they've been heard and they feel like you get them. And I love your addition of accountability. That doesn't mean we don't hold them accountable, or we don't say no to something that's clearly against human rights. Anyway, I'll go to you, John. But you're helping me figure out how to deal with this. I don't know if I can still do it, but it's very helpful, John.
Sure, I love this conversation, and I was thinking about when we're talking about Paulo Freire and how he really wrote about the need to break the cycle, the banking model of education. And he wrote about liberation. And it reminded me, I was trying to pull up this quote, and I have it right here. There's a quote that Floyd and I use in our work from the late John Lewis. And I'll just read it here. 58 years ago today, I was arrested for the first time as a participant in the sit-ins at lunch counters in downtown Nashville. Walking out to the paddy wagons, I tried to walk with a sense of pride and dignity. I felt free. I felt liberated. I felt like I crossed over. hashtag good trouble. So in the concept of dignity, and as Floyd says, standing firm in your own dignity, there is liberation. So some of our framework in general is a hope to provide the tools and the language in order to do that. And so, the first thing when Floyd and I were talking about your question, when you tweeted it out, Floyd said, that's easy. First thing you need to do is stand firm in your own dignity. You need to stand firm in your own dignity. And it reminded me just of some tips. Not tips. Donna Hicks has those 10 essentials of dignity, but she also has the 10 temptations to violate dignity. And Floyd was illustrating one is the temptation to use blame and shame to deflect your own stuff. So she has 10 things like avoid taking the bait, resist the urge to save face, resist the urge to shirk responsibility. And another one that I just want to bring up too is the tendency to avoid conflict is a way of violating our own dignity. So actually, with your scenario that you painted there, taking offense at something and then, avoiding the conflict, but let's say on the drive home, you and your partner are talking and you're just all upset. I can't believe so-and-so said this. And then you go home, and if you had a dog, you might kick the dog. It's like you're just hurting yourself. So actually avoiding that conflict is a way of violating your own dignity. It doesn't help you at all. So actually dealing with the issue at hand, standing up for yourself, standing firm in your own dignity, and that might come out as righteous indignation. It might, because you may be having an emotional response, but actually being there in not losing sight of your own dignity is the thing. I would say that one thing, if anyone offers like, here's the tips or tricks of how to deal with the situation, say it comes down to one thing, which is dignity.
Well, and I love that idea too, that if you don't have a clear sense of your own dignity, that is, if you're suffocating in your own shame, and we have a lot of shame for reasons that are like unjustified. Harder, that's again, Kristen Neff again, we're harder on ourselves than we ever be on anyone else. And if we're suffocating in our own shame, makes it hard for us to have the courage to have the right conversation. The conversation grounded in dignity, but grounded in accountability at the same time. So this has really been great. Really, really, really helpful. I'm very grateful to both of you. And we kind of run out of time. So, but I got my question in, and I've got a really good answer too. So I'm grateful to both of you.
Hey, Jim,
do you want to just take a couple seconds and tell me what you're going to present at TLC, and then we'll wrap up quickly.
John, go ahead.
Sure. One thing I was just going to share, you just reminded me, Brenda Campbell-Jones wrote the foreword on our book, and she gave me this line like 15 years ago. She said, just remember this, you can always fall back on responding to someone by saying, that hasn't been my experience. I'd love to have a conversation with you if you'd like to. And so I actually, I ended up using that just a couple weeks afterwards. So that's one thing she told me a long time ago. You can always fall back on this. So you issue the invitation.
That's part of our vocabulary. I like, I know that's not what you mean by vocabulary, but it's nice to have the words. That's very helpful.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. So TLC.
Yeah. TLC. Floyd.
I believe TLC, we're going to kind of do our typical presentation. Will certainly be another extension of what we see in the book. I believe there's a panel in which we're engaged as well. And so certainly we'll have an opportunity to dive a little bit more into these concepts. But I think what we're really trying to do is just find different ways to bring the book to life. And I think most importantly, to be able to help folks as they return to school, and lots of organizations experiencing a catalyst and wanting to really get a better understanding of how to make sure that we don't fall into the same and typical traps.
And what we try to do with the session, the breakout session, is to help people connect their own lived experiences to the broader patterns around, indignity, humiliation, and dignity, see themselves as a part of this, and have better clarity about what it is when we're talking about educational equity. So we're talking about dignity, the value and worth of all of us, and we're also talking about a heightened understanding of vulnerability. That each of us, yes, we have this equal value and worth as humans, and we also all have vulnerability, but because of our identities, because of our social context, we're not all equally vulnerable at all times. And understanding that nuance around vulnerability then provides a clearer understanding of what inequity is all about, because it's really about the frequency with which you have to endure violations to your dignity. And when we understand that need for equity, we can better address it.
Well, I can't wait. You guys are really educating me. That the panel is going to be, I'm not entirely sure the full makeup, but I know it'll be both of you, Zaretta Hammond and Natasha Sistrunk Robinson and me. And that'll be right after Ibram X. Kendi gives his talk on how to be an anti-racist. So we should be fired up for that talk. It should be a good one. But I'm already fired up. You've given me such helpful work, and I'm going to promise you that I'm not going to be in that cycle, thanks to your ideas and your work. And besides which, John, you'll hold me accountable. So I'll look forward to it. Thank you both very much. I'll just tell briefly that next week, this person is going to be with Marcia Tate, Randy Sprick, Tom Gusky. It's on giving presentations, which might seem like an archaic thing. Are we actually going to give presentations again? But they are three people I've seen present who have dramatically impacted how I give presentations. I love how they speak, and that's what next week is just about, giving presentations. I can't wait to have it. But thank you both. I'm so grateful, and look forward to our next conversation.
Right.
Take care.
Thank you, Jim.